Imagine, imagine a highly revered religious scholar.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. Now picture this exact same figure in the middle of a crowded room, totally tearing his own clothes to shreds,
Oh, wow.
shouting in this like unnatural, distorted voice, and then just walking completely barefoot through a blazing fire.
That is quite the visual.
It is, right?
Yeah.
And the question is this person experiencing the ultimate transcendent state of divine ecstasy? Or is he the victim of this chaotic, perhaps even demonic, psychological manipulation?
Well, today we're actually stepping into a centuries-old theological war zone that argues over exactly that question.
Welcome to another deep dive. If you're joining us today, you, the inherently curious learner, you know that we love to take something dense, something really layered, and figure out the mechanisms behind it.
Yeah, we're not just summarizing today. We are like tearing apart the engine of an ancient argument to really see how the gears turn.
Exactly. So our grounding source material today is a translated excerpt from a highly specific, very rigorous theological text. It's titled Refuting Sufi Rituals of Ecstasy and Dance, and we're zeroing in specifically on chapter 22.
Right, and the author of this text is presenting a fierce, really uncompromising internal critique within Islamic thought.
It's intense.
It really is. We're examining a strict orthodox perspective that is systematically dismantling the mystical practices of Sufism.
And the mission of this deep dive is to understand this massive universal tension. Because on one side, you have this orthodox religious interpretation, right?
Yes.
This framework that values strict adherence to ancient texts, an atmosphere of absolute heavy reverence and physical tranquility.
And then on the other side, you have the mystical expressions of Sufism, which, at least according to the descriptions in our source, they emphasize intense emotion, physical movement, and this overwhelming, all-consuming sense of divine love.
Yeah. We're going to look at how both sides claim historical evidence, how they interpret the exact same ancient moments completely differently, and just how fiercely this debate is actually waged.
But before we go any further, I think we really need to establish the rules of engagement for this conversation.
Good point. Essential, actually.
Yeah, because this text involves deeply held religious beliefs and incredibly passionate theological disputes. So I want to make our position crystal clear to you, the listener.
We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. In this deep dive, we are entirely impartial observers. We will never take a side.
Right.
Our job today is to impartially report on the arguments, the critiques, and the specific historical claims provided by the author of this source material. We're here to convey the author's ideas exactly as they're written down.
So just to reiterate, we are not endorsing the orthodox critique, nor are we endorsing the Sufi practices being criticized. We're simply mapping the anatomy of the argument itself. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author of this text, they don't begin with dry, abstract theory. They launch right in by painting a vivid, almost chaotic picture of the exact rituals that sparked this entire critique.
They really set a scene.
Yeah. Paint that picture for us. What is the scene the author is setting?
Well, the author opens by describing gatherings that completely shatter any expectation of serene worship.
Okay.
According to the text, these are sessions where practitioners gather for the explicit purpose of dancing, singing, clapping, and shouting. And the author specifically knows that they are shouting in what they call unnatural voices.
Unnatural voices. That specific phrase immediately sets a tone of suspicion, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
It implies that something fundamental to human nature has been, distorted or hijacked somehow.
Yeah, the author is deliberately using that language to contrast the rituals with the natural, dignified recitation of scripture.
Yeah.
The physical manifestations of this state, what the practitioners would call ecstasy, or in Arabic, wajd, they're described by the author in very stark, visceral terms.
Like what are we talking about here?
We're talking about people becoming so overwhelmed by the emotion and the rhythm that they literally tear their own clothes off in the heat of the moment. The text actually describes them engaging in acrobatic swaying.
Acrobatic swaying. That sounds more like a theatrical performance than a prayer.
That's the exact critique.
It brings to mind people just throwing their bodies around without any rational control. And the author also brings this critique into their modern context, right? Pointing out how these rituals have evolved.
Yes, so the author notes that in more modern iterations, these practices have sort of attached themselves to specific calendar events.
Like holidays.
Like the celebrations of senior Sufi figures' birthdays or other religious anniversaries. And the atmosphere described is highly festive, but in the author's eyes, deeply inappropriate for anything claiming to be religious.
Because of the vibe.
Because of the whole setup. The text points out the presence of professional musicians. It notes the mixing of men and women of all ages, which is a major point of contention for strict orthodoxy.
Because strict orthodoxy mandates gender separation during worship, right?
Exactly, to maintain focus and modesty.
And the sensory details the author includes are fascinating to me. They paint a picture of, like, senior followers sitting around smoking during these events.
Yeah, smoking while their leaders read what the author bluntly dismisses as fables about the dead.
Wow. It feels like the author is just trying to strip away the entire mystical veneer and present it as a chaotic party.
That is the exact rhetorical strategy. Furthermore, the soundtrack to all of this acrobatic swaying isn't standard liturgical chanting.
What are they listening to?
The text says the singing is fueled by intensely emotional poetry, burning with themes of love, passion, and profound sadness.
And the practitioners say this leads them to God.
Right. They claim that this emotional intensity acts as a vehicle, carrying them closer to God. They frame it as the ultimate expression of divine love.
Okay, think about it like this. Imagine you walk into a solemn, silent library reading room.
Okay, I'm with you.
You expect to quietly study, to focus your mind. Now imagine that suddenly half the room starts a flash mob because they just love the book they're reading so much.
That would be startling.
Right. They're singing, they're crying, they're swaying. The librarian is going to be absolutely horrified.
The librarian analogy works perfectly, actually, because it highlights the clash of intended environments. But we have to dig into why the librarian is horrified.
It's not just the noise.
Exactly. It isn't just because the flash mob is loud. It's because the library is built on a specific mechanism. Silence allows for deep individual intellectual focus. The flash mob replaces that individual focus with collective sensory overload.
Which totally destroys the entire purpose of the room.
Yeah.
But beyond just being, inappropriate for the setting, why does the author view this emotional expression as an actual existential threat to the religion itself?
That's a great question.
Like, why not just treat them like an annoying neighbor and say, hey, keep the noise down?
Because for the author, this isn't a volume control issue. It is an epistemological crisis.
An epistemological crisis. Break that down for us.
The author's core thesis is that these rituals are not actually divine worship at all. They label them an illegitimate innovation. The theological term is bid'ah.
Bid'ah, okay.
In strict Islamic jurisprudence, injecting new, unapproved practices into the core of worship is seen as deeply dangerous.
Let me see if I grasp the logic here. If you invent a new way to worship, like adding a choreographed dance, you're implicitly stating that the original religion, as delivered by the prophet, wasn't enough.
Yes.
You're subtly insulting the perfection of the original message by suggesting it needed an upgrade. Am I getting that right?
You have identified the exact theological nerve this touches. If the original revelation was declared perfect and complete, any addition is a corruption.
Wow. Okay.
But the author goes even further, suggesting this behavior is a sign of behavioral dysfunction or mental disturbance.
So they don't see the tearing of clothes as spiritual elevation at all.
Not even a little. They see a dangerous loss of rational control. God gave humans intellect to govern their passions, and throwing that intellect away in a fit of ecstasy is seen as a regression.
There's also this predatory aspect mentioned in the text, right? The author doesn't just see this as a personal failing, they see it as a trap.
A very deliberate trap. The author argues that these highly emotional, sensory-rich rituals operate like a net.
A net for who?
They're designed to catch people who have very little actual knowledge of Orthodox classical texts. Think about it. Rigorous, disciplined study of law and theology is hard work.
Yeah, reading heavy volumes is tough.
It requires patience and quiet dedication. But bright lights, hypnotic music, and a profound emotional release, that is instantly intoxicating.
It's a shortcut to feeling spiritual.
Exactly. The author warns that this sensory circus pulls the uneducated masses away from the difficult work of genuine faith.
And the author actually makes a historical comparison to drive this point home, looking outside of Islam to warn about the ultimate trajectory of this behavior.
Yeah, the text likens these musical gatherings to what the author views as the corrupted practices of the Old Testament.
Oh, interesting. How so?
The author points out that in previous dispensations, worship eventually degraded into playing tambourines, flutes, and lutes.
So it's a historical warning.
Right, pointing to that as a way of saying, look at history. When you let the music and the dancing into the sanctuary, you are repeating the exact same historical errors that corrupted previous divine messages.
It's a classic slippery slope argument. First, it's a tambourine. Next thing you know, the core theological message is entirely lost in the rhythm.
Exactly.
But here is the fascinating twist. The practitioners of these rituals, the Sufi scholars, didn't just shrug and say, well, we like the music, so we're doing it anyway.
No, they fought back.
Right. They actually fought back using the exact same weapons the Orthodox scholars use, historical precedent. They claimed their practices were rooted in the actions of the earliest, most revered figures in Islam.
And that leads us to the absolute core of this text. The author takes every single piece of historical evidence claimed by the mystical side and systematically dismantles it.
So let's dive into this battle over historical precedent, because this is where the text turns into a piece of ancient timeline detective work.
It really is detective work.
The mystics claim that the companions of the prophet themselves experienced these violent physical fits of ecstasy. Let's look at the story they cite about Salman al-Farsi.
Right, so the mystic scholars cite this dramatic narrative about Salman al-Farsi, a very famous companion of the prophet.
Set the scene for us.
The claim states that one day Salman heard a specific verse from the Quran being recited. It was a verse about hell, from the chapter Al-Hijr, verse 43, which translates to, "And indeed, hell is the promised place for them all."
I mean, that's a heavy, terrifying verse if you believe in literal damnation.
Incredibly heavy. And according to the Sufi claim, when Salman heard this verse, he was struck by such overwhelming spiritual terror and divine ecstasy that he let out a massive scream, fell hard on his own head, and then literally fled into the wilderness.
Wait, fled into the wilderness? For how long?
Running away for 3 straight days in a state of sheer panic.
Okay, I see the strategy here. The mystics point to this and say, look at Salman. One of the greatest companions swooned, he screamed, he lost all physical control when struck by the divine word.
Yes.
Therefore, our modern ecstatic fainting and shouting during our poetry sessions is totally valid. We're just doing what Salman did.
That is the bedrock of their historical defense.
So how does the author of our text dismantle this?
Yeah.
Do they argue about, what the scream sounded like?
They don't even engage with the scream itself. The author brings down the hammer of historical chronology.
I love a timeline rebuttal.
They point out a massive, unignorable flaw in the timeline of the story. The chapter of Al-Hijr, which contains that terrifying verse, was revealed while the prophet was still living in the city of Mecca. It's what is known as a Meccan revelation.
Wait, why does it matter what city the verse was revealed in?
Because of the timeline of the prophet's life and the migration, or hijrah, to the city of Medina.
Right.
The Meccan period was the early part of the prophethood. Salman al-Farsi, however, did not convert to Islam, nor did he even meet the prophet until much, much later, well after the migration to Medina.
Oh, wow. So the author is saying Salman couldn't have had this dramatic, first-time, mind-shattering reaction to a verse that had already been revealed and widely recited years before he even arrived on the scene.
Precisely. The author is utilizing the intense, almost forensic science of early Islamic scholarship known as Ilm al-Rijal, the science of biographical evaluation.
Ilm al-Rijal.
Early scholars meticulously tracked who met whom, when they traveled, and when they died, specifically to prevent fabricated stories from entering the canon.
That's incredibly rigorous.
Using this framework, the author states the story of Salman's panic is simply a lie. It's an impossible anachronism because the dates fundamentally do not match.
That is a devastating rebuttal. It completely pulls the rug out from under the claim.
But the author doesn't stop at timeline discrepancies. They go on to establish that the prophet actively and strictly forbade this kind of dramatic, physical showing off during the recitation of the scripture.
They provide a counter-anecdote to prove this, don't they? The story of the fainting man.
Yeah, the text recounts a verified incident where the prophet was delivering a sermon and a man in the audience suddenly collapsed, swooning as if completely overwhelmed by the spiritual weight of the words.
Which is exactly the kind of behavior the mystics are trying to validate as the highest form of worship.
But the prophet's reaction, according to the author's evidence, was incredibly stern and highly critical.
What do you do?
The prophet allegedly looked at the situation and said, "Who is this confusing our religion for us?"
Oh, wow. That's harsh.
He then laid out a psychological binary. He stated that if the man was actually sincere in his fainting-like, if he truly couldn't handle his emotions, he had unnecessarily exposed and humiliated himself in public.
And if he wasn't sincere?
If he was faking it, if he was lying to show off his supposed elite piety, then may God destroy him.
Wow. That is a zero-tolerance policy for public displays of ecstasy. It shuts down the entire concept of performative spirituality.
It really does. The author uses this incident to establish a crucial baseline for what proper worship looks like. The author argues that the true companions of the prophet did indeed experience a profound, deep reverence, a theological concept called khushu.
Khushu. Break that down for us. How does the text describe that state in contrast to the acrobatic swaying of the mystics?
Khushu is described as an intensely internal, tranquil state. When the early companions experienced khushu, their eyes would weep silent tears, and their hearts would feel genuine fear and awe of God.
So it's very quiet.
It was a heavy, solemn realization of the divine, but, and this is the critical distinction the author hammers home, none of them ever lost consciousness. None of them swooned, started screaming, or tore their clothes.
The logic is brutal in its simplicity, really.
Yeah.
The author is saying, look, the companions are universally agreed upon by all scholars as the most elite, knowledgeable, and pious believers in history.
Right.
If losing your mind in a fit of ecstasy was truly the highest form of spiritual connection, the companions would have been doing it all the time.
Exactly.
Since they didn't, the practice is an aberration.
The author demands that the mystics answer that paradox. You cannot claim a spiritual practice is superior if the best generation of believers completely ignored it.
This brings us to another fascinating layer of the debate. Because it isn't always about whether an event happened, sometimes it's about how we interpret the literal words of Scripture. I really want to talk about the claim regarding the prophet Job, or Ayub, in the Arabic tradition.
Oh, yes. The mystical scholars point to a specific verse in the Quran regarding Job.
What's the context of the verse?
In the narrative, Job has been suffering from a horrific, long-term, devastating illness. He's lost everything. Finally, God intervenes and commands him to take a specific physical action.
And what's the command?
The divine command in the text is, strike with your foot.
Strike with your foot. That is a very specific physical instruction. So how do the mystical scholars read that?
They claim this is a divine endorsement of rhythmic stomping and, by extension, religious dancing.
Wait.
They argue, quite literally, that God commanded a prophet to stomp his foot, therefore stomping is a divinely sanctioned act of worship.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is amazing to see the psychology of interpretation at work here. If you want to dance, you'll look at an ancient text, find a verse about a foot, and you will see a dance.
You'll find what you're looking for.
It really makes you wonder how much of our own biases we bring when we read ancient texts. How does the Orthodox author respond to this leap of logic?
The author basically says this interpretation shows an absolute, frankly embarrassing ignorance of Job's actual context.
They don't hold back.
Not at all. The author points out the undeniable reality of the narrative. Job was severely, agonizingly ill. He was covered in afflictions. God did not command a suffering, exhausted man to suddenly start doing a joyous jig.
Because that would be absurd.
It would be entirely divorced from reality. The author argues that the command, strike with your foot, was a highly practical, literal, physical instruction.
What was the practical purpose?
God was telling Job to strike the ground so that a miraculous, healing spring of water would gush forth. Job needed water to wash his afflicted body and to drink.
It wasn't a dance move at all. It was a medical prescription.
Exactly. The author insists that Job didn't stomp out of ecstasy or musical joy. He struck the earth out of obedience to access the cure God was providing.
That makes so much more sense.
To strip that single physical action of its urgent practical context and then turn it into a justification for recreational religious dancing in a circle centuries later is, to the author, a complete distortion of Scripture.
So if the author completely invalidates stomping, what about other types of movement? Because the source text goes into intense, granular detail about different types of walking, hopping, and jumping. It seems like the Sufis tried to find any instance of spontaneous motion to justify their rituals.
They did, and this leads to a really nuanced semantic debate. The Sufi scholars bring up a widely known, historically verified event involving the Prophet and 3 of his closest companions.
Ali, Jafar, and Zayd, right?
Yes.
Set the scene for us. What happened?
So the prophet was addressing these 3 men and gave them incredibly beautiful, deeply personal compliments.
Like what?
To Ali, he said, "You are of me and I am of you." To Jafar, he said, "You resemble my appearance and my character." And to Zaid, he said, "You are our brother and our freedman."
I mean, getting a compliment like that from the person you revere most in the universe,
Yeah.
the psychological high would be unimaginable. You would be on cloud nine.
And they were. The historical accounts agree that in response to these profound compliments, each of these grown men performed a physical movement called hajal.
And the mystics say hashal means they danced. They say, look, the prophet praised them. They danced right in front of him in response, and he didn't stop them. Therefore, dancing for joy is a prophetic tradition.
Right. And the author does not deny the event happened. The timeline checks out. The people were there. But the author fiercely disputes the Arabic definition of the word hashal.
Oh, a linguistic debate.
Yes. They dive into classical Arabic linguistics to prove that Hazal is not a choreographed dance, it is not swaying to rhythm, and it is not a collective musical liturgy.
What is the author's definition then?
The author clarifies that Hajal is a very specific, momentary way of walking or skipping. It's a physical reaction born out of a sudden, overwhelming, spontaneous burst of joy.
Can you give an example?
Think of a little kid who is suddenly handed a piece of candy and literally skips a few steps down the sidewalk before returning to a normal walk. It was a momentary, unfiltered human reaction to happiness.
Let me try to put this in a modern context. It's like the difference between a football player scoring a touchdown and doing a spontaneous, joyful leap in the end zone versus the team's management forcing every player to choreograph a mandatory 2-minute dance routine before every single play of the game.
That is an excellent framework. And to take your football analogy further, imagine if the coach started telling the players that the choreographed dance routine was actually more spiritually important than the game itself.
Oh, wow.
That is what the Orthodox author feels the Sufis are doing.
The author is saying the Sufis took the touchdown jump, that split-second human reaction, and engineered it into a mandatory, structured religious liturgy.
Exactly. The author points out that Ali, Jafar, and Zayd did not gather in a circle, hire musicians, start chanting poetry, and perform hajjal for 3 hours to achieve salvation. It was an isolated, non-ritualistic expression. Context is everything.
Speaking of context, there's another claim about movement that caught my eye. The Sufis cite a story involving a group of Abyssinians, Ethiopians, in the mosque.
Right. The incident of the Abyssinians performing in the mosque courtyard is one of the most famous historical traditions.
Why do the Sufis cite it?
They cite it because the prophet not only allowed them to perform a movement called zafin inside the sacred space of the mosque, but he actively stood and watched them, even letting his wife Aisha watch over his shoulder.
Again, on the surface, if I'm a mystic arguing my case, that sounds like a slam dunk. The prophet watched a physical performance in the mosque. But I'm guessing the author has a very specific definition for zafin, just like they did for hajjal.
You guessed correctly. The author explains that zafin is absolutely not a dance of spiritual ecstasy, nor is it musical entertainment.
What is it?
It is a highly specific martial walk. It is a weapons display, usually performed with spears.
So it's essentially a military drill.
Exactly. The text emphasizes that this was done to show bravery, physical strength, agility, and readiness for war. It was a display of martial prowess meant to intimidate potential enemies and build the morale of the community.
Quite different from a mystical trance.
Entirely different. The author states emphatically that a military drill has absolutely zero connection to the themes of divine love, mystical ecstasy, or the tearing of clothes that define the Sufi rituals.
The author is drawing a massive line in the sand regarding the intent of the physical body. A spontaneous skip of joy because you got a compliment. Fine. A military preparedness drill with spears to protect the community. Fine.
Yes.
But taking physical motion, setting it to a rhythm, and formalizing it into a repetitive religious liturgy designed to induce an altered state of mind, that crosses the line into bid'ah, illegitimate innovation.
The author is fighting a relentless war over context. To the author, an action's theological validity is entirely dependent on its original specific context. You cannot copy-paste a military drill into a prayer session and claim they hold the same spiritual weight.
But physical motion is really only half of the ritual we described at the beginning. We talked about the flash mob in the library. A flash mob isn't just movement, it's movement to music. If the author completely invalidates stomping and skipping as religious rituals, what do they do with the human voice? Because you can't suppress the fact that early Islamic history is full of poetry and singing.
True. The source text spends a massive amount of time on this because the mystical side has several strong historical claims regarding singing and poetry.
And the author takes them on?
The author addresses them with the exact same forensic, context-heavy approach.
Let's start with the story of the singing girls on Eid. This seems like a major point of contention.
The Sufis point to a very famous verified tradition where the prophet allowed 2 young girls to sing in his presence.
Right.
In fact, his closest companion, Abu Bakr, walked into the house, saw this happening, and immediately tried to scold the girls to stop them, assuming music was inappropriate in the prophet's house.
But the prophet stopped him.
Yes. The prophet actively intervened. He stopped Abu Bakr from scolding them and explicitly said, "Leave them, for it is the days of Eid." Eid being the major joyous Islamic holiday.
Wait, I have to challenge the author here. If the prophet stopped his top lieutenant from scolding the singing girls, doesn't that just mean music is allowed? Case closed.
You'd think so.
How does the Orthodox author possibly argue their way out of a direct verbal endorsement of singing?
Well, the author's refutation relies entirely on restoring the heavily nuanced context that the mystics allegedly stripped away to make their argument.
Okay, what's the missing context?
The author looks at the specific details of the scene. First, they point out the prophet's physical state. During this event, the prophet was lying down, turned away, and covered by his garment. He was resting.
Okay, so he wasn't sitting up, clapping along, and participating in the performance.
No, he was passively allowing it to happen in the background. The author aggressively contrasts this resting state with the Sufis, who actively participate, work themselves into a frenzy, and tear their garments off.
I see.
Second, the author focuses on the content of the singing. The text insists these young girls were singing decent words, likely traditional folk songs about tribal history or battles.
Not love poems.
Right. They were not singing the kind of intense, romantic, ecstatic poetry about being consumed by divine love that the Sufis use to induce their trances.
And what about the prophet's specific reasoning? It is the days of Eid.
The calendar is the final piece of the puzzle. The prophet explicitly tied his permission to the holiday. The author argues that a holiday is a universally recognized time for basic human relaxation, eating, and cultural celebration.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, the prophet's wife Aisha, who was present and watching the girls, was quite young at the time, and the prophet was indulging her youthful desire for entertainment.
I see the author's logic. A holiday is a holiday. You don't take the relaxed rules of a public festival where kids are singing folk songs and make that the mandatory core of your daily adult theological worship.
The author synthesizes all this to say, allowing young girls to sing folk songs on a public holiday for basic entertainment is a million miles away from adult men organizing a weekly, music-driven religious liturgy to achieve spiritual salvation. You cannot conflate entertainment with worship.
That makes a lot of sense. But the mystics have another story that feels a bit more scandalous because it involves a deeply revered Orthodox scholar allegedly enjoying a love song. The story of the foot-tapping scholar.
This is a remarkable piece of historical investigation by the author. The mystical scholars cited a story about a man named Sa'id bin al-Musayyib.
Who was he?
He was one of the most revered, dignified, and prominent scholars of the generation immediately following the companions. He is considered unimpeachably serious.
A pillar of Orthodox jurisprudence.
Exactly. But the Sufi claim states that this deeply serious scholar was once walking down the street, heard someone singing a romantic love poem about a woman named Zainab, and began tapping his foot to the rhythm, allegedly remarking, "This is sweet to hear."
So the mystics are saying, even your strictest, most revered Orthodox scholars appreciated a good love song and a good beat. If he can tap his foot, we can dance.
The author's response to this is fantastic because they don't just say, he was too pious, he would never do that.
What do?
They actually investigate the literary and political history of the poem itself to prove the story is absurd.
How so? Like, what did they find?
The author outright dismisses the story as a forged slander designed to ruin the scholar's reputation. To prove it, they provide the actual historical origin of the poem about Zainab.
Okay.
According to the author's tracking, the poem was written by a man named Muhammad bin Abdullah bin Numair. He was a poet who was actively flirting with and writing highly public romantic verses about a woman named Zainab.
Okay, a guy wrote a love poem.
But this wasn't just any woman. This was the sister of Al-Hajjaj.
Who was Al-Hajjaj?
Al-Hajj bin Yusuf was one of the most infamous, brutal, and terrifying political rulers and generals in early Islamic history. He was known for his ruthless suppression of dissent and his willingness to execute anyone who crossed him.
Oh, wow. So writing a public flirtatious love poem about this specific tyrant sister is practically a death wish.
It was treason. The author notes that the poet actually had to flee and become a political fugitive hiding in another city just to escape al-Hajjaj's wrath.
This is incredible. So, to disprove a religious ritual, the author literally tracks down the origins of a centuries-old love poem to prove it was written by a political fugitive about a tyrant's sister.
Yes.
The author is saying that the idea of a venerable, highly public scholar like Said bin al-Musayyib tapping his foot and openly enjoying a treasonous love poem in the middle of the street is historically laughable.
It shows how high the stakes are in this debate and how deep the author is willing to dig to protect the integrity of the orthodox figures.
Yeah.
And the author adds a final, simple layer of logic to this. They argue that even if, hypothetically, the scholar did tap his foot, it proves nothing theologically.
Because tapping a foot isn't a prayer.
Exactly. Humans tap their feet for all sorts of reasons. We tap our feet in anger and frustration while deep in thought, or just because we hear a repetitive rhythm in the environment. It is a biological reflex.
Right.
Tapping a foot does not equate to a theological endorsement of religious, ecstatic dancing as a means of salvation.
Okay, but what about the human voice itself? The mystics point out that the prophet explicitly praised people with beautiful voices.
Yes. The prophet famously praised a companion named Abu Musa, saying his voice was so beautiful when reciting the Quran that it was like he had been given a flute of the family of David.
Oh, that's a nice compliment.
He also explicitly praised the poetry of famous poets like Al-Nabiga and Hassan bin Thabit. In fact, he even set up a pulpit in the mosque for Hassan to deliver poetry defending the Muslims against rival tribes.
The mystics must look at that and say, see? Poetry and beautiful musical voices are divinely sanctioned. The prophet literally gave the poet a platform.
And the author's refutation here is grounded in simple human nature. The author argues that praising a beautiful recitation of the Quran or appreciating eloquent, well-crafted poetry is just a normal human reaction to beauty.
Right. Recognizing that someone has a nice voice doesn't mean you're authorizing people to tear their clothes off and dance in a frenzy.
Exactly. The author refuses to let mundane or contextual events be elevated to the status of spiritual mandates. You can appreciate a beautiful painting without turning the act of painting into a religious sacrament.
So we've covered the physical movements, the stomping, the skipping, the martial arts. We've covered the audio elements, the singing, the poetry, the foot tapping.
We have.
And in all of these, the author uses historical timelines, linguistic definitions, and political context to strip the mystical weight away from these anecdotes. But the final section of this text, it leaves the physical world behind entirely.
Yes. If the debate over poetry was grounded in history, the final pieces of evidence that the author refutes step entirely into the realm of the supernatural.
Let's talk about dreams, miracles, and the supernatural. Because the claims here escalate dramatically from tapping a foot to bending the laws of physics.
Yeah.
What are the extreme claims the author cites in the text?
The author quotes prominent Sufi scholars, specifically naming figures like al-Suhrawardi, who document what allegedly happens to practitioners when they reach the absolute peak of this ecstatic state.
And what happens?
The claims are undeniably supernatural. They claim that during the heights of ecstasy, Sufis have been known to float or levitate above the ground.
Literal levitation. Defying gravity.
Defying gravity. They also claim these individuals can walk across water, that they can walk straight through blazing fires without a single hair being burned, or even perform alarming, self-mutilating acts like putting lit candles directly into their own eyes without suffering any harm.
That is a massive leap from appreciating a nice poem.
It is a totally different theological battlefield. The text also mentions a story regarding a revered, highly mystical figure known as Al-Qidr.
What's the story there?
The claim states that Al-Qidr was listening to a particularly moving poem and went into such a profound state of spiritual ecstasy that he collapsed, falling hard onto his forehead.
Oh.
He began to bleed heavily from the impact, but, and here's the miraculous claim, the blood dripping from his forehead miraculously suspended in the air and never touched the ground.
Like the physical world itself refused to let his holy blood touch the dirt.
Precisely. And perhaps the most shocking claim cited by the author involves the prophet himself.
The story of the cloak. Tell me about this one, because this feels like it cuts to the very core of how the prophet is viewed.
The mystical scholars circulated a narrative that a Bedouin man once came and recited an incredibly passionate love poem in front of the prophet. The poem went, The snake of passion has bitten my liver. There is no doctor for it. Only the beloved. He has my cure and my antidote.
Very dramatic, intense, agonizing poetry.
According to this Sufi claim, hearing this agonizing poem caused the prophet and all his companions to enter into such an intense, uncontrollable state of spiritual ecstasy that the prophet's cloak literally fell off his shoulders.
Really?
And then, in this altered state, the prophet allegedly took his cloak and tore it into 400 pieces, distributing the torn scraps among his followers as blessed holy relics.
That is an astonishing claim, to say the prophet lost his physical composure, destroyed his own clothing, and handed out the pieces because of an intense love poem.
It's quite the image.
How does the Orthodox author respond to this? Because this isn't just a disagreement over the definition of an Arabic word. This feels like a battle over the core identity and dignity of the prophet himself.
The author brings down what we might call the orthodox hammer. There is an absolute, uncompromising, almost furious rejection of these stories.
Let's break down the rejection, starting with the foundation of how many of these stories are validated. Dreams.
Right.
A lot of mystical justification comes from people saying, I saw the prophet in a dream, and he told me this dance was okay, or I saw Al-Qidr in a dream, and he endorsed our singing. How does strict orthodoxy handle dream evidence?
From an Orthodox jurisprudential perspective, the author dismisses this entirely. In strict Islamic law, dreams are categorically not legal evidence, period.
No exceptions.
None. You cannot establish a religious ruling, you cannot validate a historical event, and you certainly cannot invent a new form of worship based on something someone saw while they were asleep.
Because the subconscious is unreliable.
Exactly. The religion was completed in the waking world. And the author points out that this is especially true when these dreams are reported by unknown sources, which many of these mystical tales rely upon.
Right.
If you don't know who had the dream, or if their character cannot be verified by Ilm al-Rihal, the claim is thrown in the trash.
Now, regarding the story of the 400 pieces of the cloak.
The author's reaction to the cloak story is visceral. The author highlights that this is a complete, undeniable, malicious fabrication.
They don't mince words.
And they don't just say it, they back it up by citing the absolute heavyweights of Orthodox scholarship, figures like the medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah and the modern hadith specialist al-Albani.
And what do they say?
These scholars universally declare the story of the cloak to be a fabricated lie with no authentic chain of transmission.
Why does this specific story strike such a nerve with the Orthodox scholars?
Because the author views it as deeply, fundamentally disrespectful to the dignity of the prophet. The Orthodox view of the prophet is one of absolute emotional control, immense dignity, and profound, sober reverence for God.
It contradicts their whole image of him.
Completely. The suggestion that he would lose his composure, drop his clothes, and tear them to shreds over an empty love poem about a snake biting a liver is seen as a grotesque insult to his character. To the Orthodox mind, the prophet governs his emotions. His emotions do not govern him.
Okay, so the cloak story is a fabricated lie. But what about the supernatural acrobatics? The levitation, the fire walking, the bleeding without the blood hitting the ground. There were likely hundreds of witnesses to some of these feats over the centuries. Does the author just plug their ears and say, I don't believe you, it didn't happen?
This is where the author's conclusion gets very dark and, frankly, very fascinating. The author doesn't necessarily deny that people witness strange phenomena.
No, they don't.
No, they don't say it was all just cheap parlor tricks, but they definitively state that these events are not divine miracles.
If a man walks through fire unharmed, and it isn't a miracle from God, what is it?
The author concludes that if these levitations or firewalks are genuinely happening, they're the ultimate proof of demonic manipulation.
Demonic manipulation. They are attributing the miracles of the mystics to Satan.
Yes. The theological framework here is that Satan and demonic forces will play tricks, create visual illusions, or manipulate the physical world specifically to validate these illegitimate practices in the eyes of the gullible.
Wow.
The author argues that demons will protect a man in the fire if it means convincing 1,000 onlookers that dancing and tearing clothes is the true path to God.
That is terrifying logic.
It is a brilliant theological defense mechanism. By attributing the supernatural to demons, the author doesn't have to deny the reality of the witnesses, but they entirely strip the event of its divine authority.
Right.
The goal of this demonic manipulation, according to the text, is to pull people away from the quiet, difficult, moderate fear of God and trap them in this chaotic, sensory-driven circus.
So what does this all mean? When you zoom out and look at this entire deep dive, From the arguments over what city a verse was revealed in, to the semantic definition of a skipping walk, to tracking down a fugitive poet, all the way to accusations of demonic levitation, it seems like the two sides aren't just arguing over different texts.
No, it's bigger than that.
They are arguing over the very definition of truth itself.
That is the crux of the entire conflict.
One side, the mystical side, values internal, personal experience. They value the feeling of ecstasy, the supernatural vision, the overwhelming, undeniable emotion. To them, if it feels profoundly divine, if it moves the heart to tears and the body to motion, it must be true.
Yes.
But the author, the Orthodox side, relies strictly on external, verifiable data, verified historical chains, literal textual readings, and the undeniable timeline of events. If it cannot be historically proven to have been done by the prophet or his companions, it is rejected, no matter how profoundly beautiful it feels.
If we synthesize everything we've looked at today, the source text presents a rigorous, unyielding defense of Orthodox boundaries. The author is defending what they view as the pristine purity of classical theology against what they perceive as chaotic, emotionally driven, and ultimately dangerous innovations.
It is a battle between viewing worship as an act of profound, tranquil reverence, that silent, heavy contemplation we talked about in the library at the beginning, versus viewing worship as an act of ecstatic, physical, overwhelming passion.
And the author makes it abundantly clear that in their view, you cannot mix the two. The moment you introduce the flash mob, the library ceases to exist.
Why should you, the listener, care about a theological debate from centuries ago over hopping versus dancing? Why does this matter if you aren't a theologian or a historian?
Because it's relatable.
Exactly, because this text is fundamentally about the universal human tension between structure and emotion.
It is a tension that exists in every facet of human organization.
Every single institution, whether it is a massive global religion, a national government, a legal system, or even just the corporate culture at your office, struggles with this exact same dynamic.
How so?
How do you maintain order, tradition, and the strict rules that hold the whole thing together without crushing the spontaneous, passionate human spirit of the people inside it?
If you lean entirely into structure and rules, you risk becoming cold, dead, and rigid. You become a bureaucracy when no one feels anything.
Like a library where no one is actually allowed to enjoy the books they are reading. But if you lean entirely into emotion, passion, and personal experience,
You risk chaos, fragmentation, and losing the core identity of the institution entirely. The flash mob takes over, the books get trampled, and the original purpose is forgotten.
it is a delicate, often violent balance that human beings have been trying to strike since the dawn of time. And this text gives us a front row seat to one of the most intense, highly intellectual, and historically grounded battles over where exactly that line should be drawn.
It really highlights how historical memory is utilized. Both sides look at the exact same history, the same prophet, the same companions, the same ancient words, and see completely different validations for their worldview.
So I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've explored today.
Okay.
If pure, spontaneous emotion, like a companion doing a momentary skip of joy because they received a beautiful compliment, loses its authenticity the moment you formalize it into a required, weekly ritual, how does any long-standing tradition keep its followers genuinely engaged over the centuries?
That's a profound question.
Can you ever truly mandate passion? Or does trying to organize ecstasy ultimately destroy it?
That is the ultimate question for any organized tradition.
Thank you for joining us as we unpack the mechanisms of this incredible historical and theological text. Keep questioning the things you read, keep looking for the context behind the claims, and most importantly, keep exploring. Until next time.